Kate Mila Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. It's time for our Saturday book. Before I even start, I know you're not interested in my personal problems, but this has been such a week with the sound and the issues, the technical issues. So I successfully recorded the entire book yesterday because I'm pressed for time. And in my delirium, I proceeded to erase it. And I was very careful to erase it in every possible way. There's no way to bring it back. So I have to do it again. So maybe it's an important lesson that we need to review, or I need to review. Whatever. So what's our book? They Walked with Jesus by Dolores Cannon. Now, caveat from the very beginning, I haven't had a sudden transformation and become any particular religion. I just think that this book is the sequel to Jesus and the Essenes. It's very popular. Everybody loves Dolores Cannon's books, and I've promised I'm going to do them. But interestingly enough, it segues into next week's book beautifully. And it is interesting. Important to remember that Dolores Cannon was raised in a conservative Christian home. That's the context. Now, she moved far from that, but she couldn't help but use it as her point of reference quite frequently. But it makes for an interesting read. It's an interesting narrative, in which I almost virtually have it memorized. So, They Walk with Jesus, Video 1, Dolores Cannon, written in 1994. This is one of her earlier books, and it's been edited, it's been updated, and they do talk about the fact that, she changed, she evolved, her ideas grew as her experiences grew. So let's just get right into this. Chapter 1, Discovering the Jesus Encounters. So she's talking about the entire history of humanity, that it's hidden in the subconscious of every person. You carry within you this knowledge. It's encoded, we now know, or something's encoded in mathematical patterns that don't occur in nature, encoded in our DNA, in the crystalline structures there. There's also light in our DNA, which we know is energy. And the belief that Dolores Cannon is working from, many people believe this, is that our subconscious carries with it all knowledge of all experience of all humanity. It's like having your own personal Encyclopedia Britannica. And I joke, but it is serious. In 1979, of course, as we well now know, and if you haven't been following our Dolores Cannon books, you can jump in any time, but it's interesting to see them as they evolve. And I do have a Dolores Cannon playlist on my channel's playlists, and I tried to collect all of the books that we've covered by her. I think I got them all. If I missed some, please let me know. It's really annoying. I've made a 6 gazillion videos over the past couple of years, and scrolling through them, it takes a while, and you can easily miss some. So let me know if I've forgotten to add one to the playlist. The most recent one is towards the bottom of the playlist, so there are about 25, I think, books, or 25 videos relating to her on there. So in 79, she began doing hypnosis, and she discovered once in a while people would tap into memories of past lives. She figured that was all that could possibly be. People who had no historical education or identification with anything that they're talking about. She said that it seemed like these were memories that were within them that were dormant, and if you knew how to access them, you'd be able to find them maybe for everybody, and that it became quite clear that they influenced the present. Now, she was using hypnosis for treatment of phobias and bad habits and sleep disturbances, and trying to understand what should I do with my life? And this, in the course of these treatments, she discovered or evolved her own method of hypnosis that involved tapping into sort of a somnambulistic state. And there's an abbreviation for her method, which she taught to many people. It's quite popular. And of course, despite the fact that 16 million viewers have sent me the letters, the abbreviation for this method over and over again, I have a mental, I can't remember it. It's HOT something, I don't know. It's terrible. But it's easy enough to get this information anymore. Thank you, Dr. Google, right? So she discovered this, that some people she could get all the way into a somnambulistic state and access their subconscious. And we don't remember these things because they're in our subconscious, which is a protective filter. It lets us focus on the here and now, which is really the most important thing. We're not supposed to be spending all our time traveling down memory lane. However, for some people, an understanding of what came before helps them deal with real blocks that they have in this life. So you can take someone back to a very specific day. For example, let's return to your 12th birthday in this past lifetime. They'll remember everything. So it's like having a gigantic library in your subconscious, and access to it is selective. Past life therapy makes memory sharp enough to discover patterns and to deal with unresolved karma that's interfering with your present life. It's very helpful. Many of the clients had not been helped, excuse me, by conventional therapy, years of conventional therapy. Phobias, obsessions, fears, relationships, other issues, they often became clear when they went through these hypnotic sessions with Dolores Cannon. They could be traced to events in a past life, like physical disabilities, problems with your throat, chronic cough, pain. They would often trace it back to some injury or event in a past life. Once acknowledged, it seemed to help to take care of these physical issues. And to be reassured of the validity of these memories, she said, you can rest easy. These people were not making this stuff up. Pre-internet, none of these people knew one another. They were from many different locations, social groups. She had not written her books yet. She collated many sessions before she ever published them. She kept sessions that were similar from different people. They weren't feeding off of each other. And yet people with no background, very little education, at least not specific to things they talked about. Later, she would go back and research the historical context and was shocked at how accurate many of them were. She says on very rare occasion will somebody have a really interesting past life. They're very mundane. They're boring. They're dull. People are usually farmers, or, they're having a little booth in some ancient agora, or they're servants, or they're just poor people, stable boys. There's nobody that, very few people come forward and say, oh, I'm Cleopatra, and I'm Napoleon. That's just not a thing. She said sometimes people will be like humble, stable hand in the house of somebody famous. And the classes don't mix, the social strata don't engage with each other. But if you're serving wine in a big hall and you see the interactions of nobility, you might pick up a little gossip. Traveling minstrels, that's a good example. We'll hit on one of those later. Just she was assured by the fact that people weren't bragging about how rich, famous, popular, and powerful they were in their past lives. So 1985, she wrote Jesus and the Essenes, and she did it after working with a subject who described being a member of this community. And this was a high school girl. And Canon really didn't know what she was talking about either. There wasn't a whole lot known or published about the Essenes, the Gnostic Gospels, Qumran. Those are the kinds of esoteric things before the internet that only people with really niche interests might know about. This high school girl, she dropped out of high school to join the military. If you remember, well, in other books, she is talked about in other books. She didn't have any interest or knowledge of history or these sorts of things. And Canon thought, you know, she worked with this girl who did the Essenes book, and Canon never thought she'd have the opportunity to engage with that period of time or those individuals ever again. She didn't go searching for it. It was kind of a surprise. She says almost all subjects tell these ordinary lives, and she said once she had a subject who was convinced that she was John the Baptist's mother, and this woman was really convinced of this. And to Canon, it was obvious that this was a fantasy. She couldn't get her into the right kind of hypnotic state. She couldn't get her to depart from all the Bible information. She said she wasn't narrating the real knowledge of a past life. The woman did not believe, did not behave like she was normally would in a trance. And when she ostensibly woke up, she was too eager to get the tape and listen to it. And this really sealed the deal for Canon. She said that almost none of her subjects ever want to listen to the tapes. They're completely freaked out. They deny that this could have been real. They wake up from their trance and they say, oh, well, I'm so embarrassed. I must have made this up. What am I talking about? And they deny it, they reject it, and they don't want to hear about it, and they don't want to listen to the tapes. Canon talks with them afterwards and consults about physical issues they might have or phobias or whatever. But the details of these life stories that they tell, it freaks them out and they don't want to talk about it. So she never expected to hear more about Jesus or the Essenes. And in 86, 87, she had an unusual event. Two different women didn't know each other, two different times, were regressed, and they both went to a life in Jesus's time, same time period, and were describing him. And Canon said, this is really a rare opportunity. I'm gonna jump at this opportunity. So chapter 2 is a meeting with Jesus. So this first woman, these two women, this first woman is named Mary in real life, which I thought was kind of funny. And she's in her 30s. She's a single mother, and she has a landscaping business. And she was looking to solve a problem, but she couldn't say exactly what it was. And it turns out later, her picker is broken. She has a hard time finding the right guy. So Canon regressed her to just whenever, put her under. And in her first session, she recalled a former boring life, and in her second session she recalled a different former boring life, and in her third session the story started getting more interesting. She found herself in a grove of trees, unfamiliar to her, and keep in mind she's a landscaper. She knew trees. I don't know what these trees are. I've never seen them before. And she described herself, well, first she saw 4 people, but then she saw that she looked similar to them in dress, wearing white homespun linen robes, kind of, a hole in the head and a hole for the arms, basically, that were belted with a cotton rope, and they wore sandals. And one of the women had a kerchief. Mary herself was a teenage girl with long hair. She said her name was Abigail, and she knew, somehow, that she had walked to this grove from the village. She knew that the people she was meeting, these 4 other people, were a special group. She said, I'm the youngest. I don't know as much as they. They're the teachers, and I feel unworthy. I'm very young, and they're very wise. They are wise in spiritual teachings, and this is passed on by word of mouth because nobody reads. There were no books. Maybe in the library at Alexandria, maybe in a Roman villa you'd find a scroll. Maybe in Egypt you'll find a papyrus, but not in, the middle of nowhere in the Middle East. So she says that they're in Palestine and that she is going to be a teacher. That's her path. And that they were teaching her the mysteries. So she was new to the group. This is only her third meeting with them. She says, but they already feel like extended family. Cannon's, her brain is working and she's speculating that they're a secret Gnostic group just from the way this young woman is talking. And what's the time period? She wants to establish that. So she asks Abigail, have you ever heard the word Messiah? And Abigail says, I think I've heard it, but I think this is something that's supposed to be happening in the future. I'm not really sure. And it becomes really apparent this girl is uneducated. So Cannon asks her, who's the ruler of your country right now? And she says, I don't know. I'm from a small village. It's very peaceful. It's in the middle of nowhere. And then she goes into describing her mother's flatbread. She has no interest in the politics. And she says, I have a small sister. And it's a real problem for me in my life that I am not called to be married. I'm preparing myself with this secret group for a public service in the temple, and I need a very broad understanding of spiritual truth, but I have no interest in being a wife and mother. So Cannon moves her forward to the future a little bit. She's older now. She's 14 years old. The teachers, of course, are gone. She's in the temple, not in a grove. But she says, I'm not being allowed to teach because the elders who are men aren't happy with my knowledge. They say that women are not worthy to be taught or to be teachers. Before this, parents brought their children and she taught them with games and stories and dances. And she said that she was able to bring light to their mind without the elders being aware of what was happening. She showed children, for example, a pet dove and how it could leave its cage and be free, and told them that they could leave the cage of their minds and realize the world was a much larger place. She describes two red cylinders, and she says they're used for rhythm, like some kind of percussion. When the kids dance, it's a special time with the kids. They're learning physical expression of emotion and manifesting action. They're giving voice to feelings and action to feelings, to learn freedom and joy. And all of this is really unique because in this time period, life was a slog. Most people didn't philosophize. Most people didn't talk about their feelings. They didn't get all sensitive and touchy-feely. They were living very hand-to-mouth and very simply, primitively in this area and time. And there wasn't a lot of time or interest in introspection. So this was unique and unusual. Cannon asks her, well, what city? And she said, well, Jerusalem. She's from a village, but Jerusalem is now where she is. She says she's attached to a temple. She's solitary. In other words, not with her family. Her understanding of God is different from that of what the men believe. And they put up with her if she just shuts up and takes care of the children. So essentially, she's a babysitter. The priests, she says, are closed and dark and not of the truth. They keep people away from the immediacy of an experience with God. She said, God is not far, and God is not angry. So I guess extrapolating from that, God is not Yahweh. God does not, interesting, I would say God does not require sacrificing animals. She said, God is in us, within us in every breath. We are God in physical form. We are it. We are each holy. We are not rabble. And I guess that's what the priests call them. She says, at the moment, our essence cannot shine forth. Common people don't get to God through the priests. Okay, I'm getting hiccups now, just to make things more interesting. She says, I'm the only woman who's a teacher, and they only let her teach because she's dealing with the very small children to keep them and her out of the way. Cannon says at this time there were no schools. Now, a lot of what Cannon intersperses in this narrative is research she did after the fact. She said there were no schools. Boys could study scriptures in the synagogue, but the only knowledge was the law, the book of Moses. So the education was only a religious education, and the rabbi was somebody who knew the religion, a learned man. It's very male chauvinist society. Women were narrowly defined in their roles, and they had no definition, no education, and unlimited to only one spot in the temple physically. Abigail said, well, I'm not Jewish. I'm actually, like Jewish religion, she goes, I'm actually an Essene. And the Essenes don't have all these Jewish religious restrictions. And it's not real popular with the priests. This irritated the male priests that she was so educated, and especially in areas that they didn't know. So they're feeling quite threatened. Working with the children alleviates that threat for them. It gets her busy and out of the way. And she's very frustrated that she can't really teach. She says, there's a man here. She hasn't really talked to him yet, but he has the same knowledge as she does. He says to people, the kingdom of God is within. The temple should not separate God and man. That man should invite God into his heart without the sacrifices or the intercessions of the priests. So this man was teaching to a crowd in another part of the complex. And there's a lot of description of the buildings and stuff, and I'm not including that because it's really hard to... You have to include the entire description or it makes no sense. You can't just describe 2 walls. You have to describe the whole thing. And it becomes onerous and boring and hard to imagine. So if you're really curious, I would recommend reading the book. But suffice it to say that this is not just one church temple like we would think. This is a huge complex, and it includes multiple layers and levels and assigned areas, which we'll talk a little bit about. So he's in an area where he's allowed to do this, but the priests are in a more sanctified area. He speaks with authority, and some start calling him the Son of God. And she said that she wants to leave the kids to go see him. She can hear him, to go see him. Because she has a very strong sense that she knows him. She doesn't know him, but she's drawn to him. So she shuts out the teaching of the priests because she says they're pompous. And this other man has a light around him. She can see in the distance, and he is the light, the white light. She can see in the distance his clothes. They're just brown, simple stuff. And he sees her and he approaches her by approaching the kids. And she says, we're of like mind. He knows that, I know that. We recognize each other when we make eye contact. Now, we're not talking romance. We're talking something significantly different. She says he has love in his eyes, but she's not he's not falling, this is not a rom-com. So the subject told Canon that in her real life today, she'd been married and divorced 3 times. Remember I said she had a broken picker. And what really happens, she told Canon, was the people she loved always get taken away. So there's a little hint there or something going on. She did not know a man. She did not know who this man was that she described to Canon. And Canon felt that this showed that she wasn't concocting the story. She married the subject out of trance, was not saying, oh, well, I'm cavorting with one of the greatest religious leaders of all history. No, she said, I don't know who that guy was. I don't know. But she's beginning to get this realization that her problem with men is her expectation of them and the influence of this man in her regression. She says this just felt important to her. Chapter 3, the healing. So the next session, Mary shared some memories from the last regression. She described dancing with the children. The dance was meant to teach them that sometimes in life they need to go inward, to be quiet, to be alone. Other times to go outward, to share their light, to teach a balance between contemplation and action. She did much spiritual teaching this way, and the men in the temple, they have no idea what she's doing. She's just keeping the kids quiet. So previous to starting these sessions, she had been moved in her present life to buy a little pottery dove that she called Paloma. And she realized now, because she felt some sort of subconscious spiritual connection to the dove from the temple, the pet dove. and she had been close to it. She communicated with it and used it in her spiritual teachings. So this session she was able to return to the life as Abigail, working with the kids. And this doesn't always happen. When Canon would put people under, they wouldn't necessarily return to the same life. But this is a significant life, and her subconscious is allowing her. So unbeknownst to the priest, the children are vessels for knowledge and training that she gives. And at some point later in life, this information is going to help them. It will stay with them. She says, we can prepare children how to respond to their world later. We can give them the tools. Priests say that she's safe over there doing the women's work, but they don't realize they've given her a huge opportunity to influence a generation of children in this area. They intimidate the children in their attitude, their outfits, their gruffness. The children don't respond well to the priests, so they gravitate to her. And she feels full of a lot more knowledge than she's able to give people, and she wants to know how to give it and to whom. The priests know that she has mystical knowledge, and they don't want her to share it with common people, so they've bottled her in. She says, I'm not being allowed to do what I've been prepared to do. My head feels tight and full. They go by the letter of law in the Old Testament, the Bible, the Torah, and they don't have any use for knowledge of the heart. She's got esoteric knowledge, and the priests don't get that this is a complement to the law and not an obstacle. And they see it as a frivolous thing in the mind of a woman and not of any kind of reason. They lose the spirit of the law because they look too much to the letter of the law. And Canon says, well, if you need to release this knowledge, you can give it to me. And she's told by Abigail, you need to be initiated to understand it. And then you'd have to decide if you want the responsibility to carry this information. And Canon says, well, okay, would you initiate me? And Abigail says, it's up to you, but you have to not take this lightly. And so she goes on to tell about seeing the man of light, as she calls him again. This is the light, white light completely around him. It's like he walks in a capsule of light. And she says it's really just the outward manifestation of his inner light. Not everybody can see it, but he's like a diamond. It's powerful. And because of proximity to him, these kids who have a soft, glowing light start to take on this bright white light. He speaks to people with authority. He's not pleased at their behavior, and he's giving firm explanations about things. The people around him who are listening tend to be dark, not externally, but their light is muted, and their energy is like lumps of coal, and he gently is able to pass on his light to them. She sees this happening. She says he's loving and that he wants to turn them into diamonds. She says she'll listen to him later, but now her job is to give these children a cocoon of protection, a sphere of colored light around them. She feels that his and her energy recognize each other, that he sees light around her and the children and will respond and come over. His light expands into their cocoon and the kids glow more, like I said. She has the sense that he's a grown-up version of what she's teaching them. And she feels that this whole thing is completely out of time and space. The presence of these glowing children has helped to transform the people that are dark in their aura, like coals. It has given them color. So such a significant thing, because many of the books we've read having to do with all sorts of esoteric, philosophical, metaphysical, ET things all say the same thing. That there are people on this planet that go about their daily business. You would never notice them as anything unusual. It's a subconscious reaction to them because their energy, their light, you will respond to it and you will pick up that energy just by their proximity. Walk past them on the street, stand behind them in line at the grocery store, they're your neighbor, they're at a meeting. They don't know they're doing it and you won't know you're receiving it. And nevertheless, that's their mission, is to be the source of this light that they can impart almost unconsciously. It's subconscious. So we're not on the same plane, she says, as this crowd of people. His presence has suspended her and the kids in their own world apart from the crowd. His presence is energy that will stay with the children forever, even into other lifetimes. She and he recognize each other on a different energy level. He recognizes the work she's doing, and she says now her head is feeling better. They share the same burden. They communicate it telepathically, so he's actually communicating with her. She says, we have a similar path. That's what's going on here. She feels like it's an out-of-body healing experience. She says, he's at a level I've never known. He's helped us to advance on our path by increasing our vibration. It lets the children know how worthy each is, the energy and her teaching, validating each of their individual spirits, not something they get in their culture. She says they got to transcend and to know the reality of spirit within. The kids see that they can attain what he is and share it with others. This is an enormous gift, and many lifetimes more advanced now. That they are many lifetimes more advanced. He's a finished product. He has elevated himself already and has come to help other people and is elevating them just by proximity. It lets us know that we are capable of doing the same. And I just want to intercede here and tell you that our book next week talks about this in slightly different terms. So let's try to remember, tuck it into the back of our mind, that this presence of energy of one person can have an enormous effect. I'm saying it out loud so that I can remember it from today till next week. She says, we're all children of God, and the lumps of coal just have a longer path. They're not bad. They're just on a different, slower path. All of us are returning to our light that emanates from the source, God. And she agrees to share the knowledge with Dolores Cannon. So Mary ended these sessions months later. She ended the sessions. Months later, she met Cannon at a party and came up to her and said, you changed my life. You completely changed my life. In this life, you know, she had 3 divorces, and she saw that she'd been trying to recapture the love that she felt coming from this individual in her past regression. Now, notice no one's using any names. Cannon's not telling her, oh, well, you met Jesus. That's not even being brought up. I think there's kind of an unspoken understanding of it, but they're not, nobody's Napoleon, you know? So she says this love that she felt emanating from him, she'd been seeking it all of her life, and no normal human being, man, certainly no man, could measure up. So she was basically comparing all of her boyfriends to Jesus in a nutshell. So now she was able to relate to ordinary men because she was able to adjust her expectations, normalize them, and she felt very released from this burden. Cannon was not able to find out more about this Abigail person, so she just, you know, going back. So that's the end of that part. Chapter 4, the Temple and Old Jerusalem. So these sessions in 86 and 87 that got published in 93 are a good sequel to Jesus and the Essenes. And Cannon said, only then did they begin to research to avoid contaminating the subject. So here's what can happen. If she went into these sessions, like she heard the first session, and she says to herself, this sounds like the time of Jesus and the temple. So before they have a next session, she goes and researches, and she's got all this knowledge floating around in her energy field. And she goes into the session, and how does she know then that she hasn't shared a telepathic communication from the subject, or the subject hasn't picked up on her knowledge and spewed it back out at her? So she wants to keep herself a tabula rasa, a clean slate, a blank mind, Dolores Cannon's, so that she can just be receptive to whatever is told to her. After the whole thing, then she starts to research it. And she says she's seen ESP at work in these sessions where a subject will answer a question before she has even said it out loud. It's in her head, and they'll answer it. But often she said it's a twist. It's not exactly what she thought it would be. So that also surprises her. Cannon said she did all the research for this in a library because it was pre-internet. Sorry, my little dog is clicking around here. She says that her knowledge of Jewish history in Israel was non-existent. Many tourists, she says, have the illusion they're going to go to the Holy Land and they're going to walk in the places on the soil where Jesus had put his foot. She says this is not possible. The terrain and the places don't exist now. The only reason anything exists of the temple, the city of Jerusalem, is because the holy city is holy to three of the world's major religions, Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And it's one of three in Islam, but nevertheless, it's important to all three religions. And as you'll see, we'll get a little bit into what's left, what disappeared, how that happened. And all you need to do is go anywhere ancient where there's a modern city and then the archaeology, because almost inevitably you'll quickly find that the modern city is way up high and the archaeology is down in a pit or at the bottom of a cliff, because over all these millennia, the ground changes. There's tectonic movement, there's flooding, things shift, dirt gets formed from decomposition of stuff, organic material, and it builds in layers. And Pompeii, Herculaneum, they're way below the modern city. Frequently, they'll be in somebody's basement in the modern city of Arcolano, and they'll go in to fix something in the basement, and they'll come down through the ceiling of some ancient Roman structure in Herculaneum. 2/3 of the ancient city of Herculaneum are still beneath the modern city, undiscovered, undisturbed. Troy, when, what's his name, Schwann or something? When in the late 1800s, when this man, I believe he was German, haven't read about this in a while, he thought, what if the story of the Trojan War and Helen and Paris and, all that stuff, what if that wasn't a fairy tale? What if that wasn't a myth? What if that's actually history? What if we took the book and went to that part of the world and used the book like a guidebook and investigate if we can find where the original city of Troy was? Long story short, he did. He found 8 layers above the original city of Troy. When they finally got to the original, they found artifacts that were described. And people had thought that it was all just a story. They found jewelry, like this beautiful golden band with draping pieces of gold that belonged to Helen of Troy, and all kinds of other stuff. So that was a real revelation to people that maybe ancient writing, as in Escaping Eden, Paul Wallace, maybe ancient writing isn't such fiction after all. So people go to the Holy Land hoping to, walk the steps of Christ, and fine, but they aren't really. Jerusalem survives because of the 3 religions that have supported what little is left. Cannon said that she hoped to be able to find in her research a description of the temple, and she was shocked to learn that nothing from the time of Christ exists. The sites that are shown to the tourists are newer buildings that were built on top of the old site, and supposed sites they weren't even sure, but not the real foundations and not the real historical buildings. There are old sites, but they're not the original, and they're created over centuries by Christian pilgrims. 3,000 years ago, Jerusalem area was conquered, changed hands, and it was altered many, many, many times. Often new buildings use the debris of the old buildings. They would take the scattered stones and building materials from the demolition sites and use them. They still don't know the exact site of the biblical Bethlehem. They have no idea. Scholars today say when Herod killed the babies, there were probably about 15 baby boys that they killed. That this mass slaughter that's described in the Bible, it's exaggerated, it's hyperbole, it's movie talk, it's Hollywood. Today's Jerusalem is northwest of where the ancient city is thought to have existed. And today there are many cities under the layers, and some sites today are 100 feet above the old city. The topography has changed so dramatically. There was a valley that's described called the Tyropian Valley at one side of the city of Jerusalem on the outskirts, and it was a gigantic valley, you know, and now it's just a slight depression in the ground. Things change. Another example would be the city of Ostia in Italy, about 15 miles south of Rome. It was the port that served the city of Rome, and on the Tiber. And over time, the ocean has gone far out. You can't even see them. The ocean is miles and miles and miles away. So you have this port city with all these little what's left of the buildings with tiles depicting seafood and sea creatures and mythological mermaid type things. And because it was right on the coast, it was serving the fishermen who came in. It was a thriving port city. And then everything would get stuck on a boat and taken upriver to Rome. It was the main thoroughfare between the Mediterranean and Rome. And it's so far from the ocean now, you just wouldn't even know that it had been a port. And just natural receding of the water land building from deposits of silt, sort of thing. Jerusalem used to have a lot of hills and valleys. Now it's a plateau. The ancient sites were often so steep because of the hills that they had stairs on the streets instead of just streets. The ancient city had many ethnic quarters, many nationalities and languages, and was one of the main hubs of the ancient world. Canon describes some of the walls and buildings and bridges, and I'm not getting into it. And under the city, there was a honeycomb of galleries and passages for the purposes of war, big enough to ride a horse through, a war horse. In 70 AD, the Romans had to fight underground, and it filled these underground passages with dead bodies, and the stench came up above the ground and was poisoning the air of the city. So the Romans plugged up all the vents, the traps, the openings, the tunnels, and over time, that was 2,000 plus years ago, over time, people forgot. They were forgotten, not known. There was all this stuff underground. 3,000 years since the Temple of Solomon was built by David's son Solomon. Now it's the Dome of the Rock. All that remains of the temple is this rock that's significant in Islam. And the temple and the palace of Solomon are somewhere underground. They're not even exactly sure. Accurate information on the reconstruction is buried under millennia of debris and rubbish, because, you know, Herod rebuilt a lot of stuff after the first destruction of the temple. This includes the original copy of the law is under there someplace. That they speculate that the Ark of the Covenant is hidden under there, although that's not what Graham Hancock says. The sword and the seal. The royal sepulcher of the kings of Judah, David and Solomon and all those guys, are believed to be under there. There's a whole complex of chambers. The story is that Herod stole some burial goods until a giant flame burst out and it killed his guards, and he fled and abandoned the search of all these underground tunnels, and then was blocked up and the location was lost to time. I imagine maybe there was an accumulation of gases or something under there. Doesn't bear thinking about. Nebuchadnezzar, I spelled it phonetically and I still got it wrong. I've never been able to say this word. Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon destroyed all 100% of the people that he sent out of exile from Jerusalem. After 50 years they returned, but he destroyed anybody who didn't leave. He destroyed. Nehemiah rebuilt a smaller version of the temple. Eventually the Romans took over and appointed Herod the king of Judea from 40 to 4 BC, and Herod rebuilt Jerusalem into a greater city, included rebuilding the temple and the area around it, which only lasted for 40 years after Christ, and then the Romans destroyed it again. But he was kissing up to the Jews in the area by rebuilding it for them. All of Jerusalem was destroyed except for Herod's palace the second time around, and the Romans even dug up the foundations and threw the stones in the river. And all the inhabitants were killed or removed. They then deforested the area for 11 miles, within 11 miles. They destroyed Qumran. They took Masada, where all those Jews collected like on a mesa, kind of a fortress on a mesa. And after a long siege, they killed themselves rather than be captured by the Romans. And the only thing left is the Wailing Wall, but it's not the original. It's not the original temple. It's a reconstruction. The Romans were famous for destroying things entirely. Scipio, when he defeated Carthage, I think it's like Tunisia, it's on the Mediterranean, the north coast of Africa, or it was, Queen Dido, many an opera written about her. Aeneas came and fell in love with her, that whole story. When Scipio destroyed, this is before Rome was ever, the story of Dido and Aeneas is long before Rome was founded, because he goes on to help found Rome. Many years later, millennia or whatever later, Scipio, Roman general, defeated Carthage. And he sowed the fields with salt so that nobody could ever live there again. They actually plowed salt into the ground. So that's the Romans. So the temple was covered in polished limestone, which must have been beautiful because this is a hot, sunny climate, and that glows like this beautiful white thing. So it must have been beautiful. And the inner part, the really important building of the temple, the Sanctum Sanctorum, where all the and surrounding area where the real important people are allowed, was covered in gold. And it had an inexhaustible underground water supply. Besides the sanctuary, the porticos, the cloisters, the basilica, there were places for animals to be bought. There were money changers. It was quite the place. They had a court of the Gentiles for the non-Jewish public. They had a separate women's area in the court of the Israelites. The Holy of Holies, the Sanctum Sanctorum, was in the center of all these areas that led into it, like an inner core. And that's where the Ark of the Covenant was stored, which was, hinted that it may have been some kind of energy weapon, but we'll never know. And it was restricted according to your worthiness, your cleanliness, and your status. They had doors of brass there that took 20 people to open and close. They were so huge and heavy. At the time, it was the largest religious sanctuary in the world. The part of the building was plated in gold, as I said. Herod paid for it by increasing the taxes on the people. He thought that a fancy temple would appease the Jewish people, but the taxes tended to negate that. So Jesus rejected the purity and the holiness of these inner sanctums and, the whole hierarchical thing, the ritual, the ceremony. He thought that the priests forgot the individual's needs. He was said to preach in an area where anyone could be, so it must have been the court of the Gentiles. Cannon was surprised to find the description of Abigail's area, where the stairs with the children and the area where Jesus spoke, it seemed to agree with the historical record of what it looked like. Chapter 5, an introduction to Jesus' niece. Now, this is getting interesting. In 1987, she had a session with a woman named Anna, who was a Reformed Jew, which is a modern version of Jewish, and she did not know Hebrew. They're not very traditional. So she and Cannon worked together because Anna was so easy to regress, and she was a really honest person. She wasn't going to make things up. So in trance, she saw herself as a 12-year-old girl named Naomi, and she wished she was a boy. She said, I can't do what I want to do, what I'm supposed to do, because I'm a girl. I'm supposed to be spreading teaching, but the Nazarene told me that I couldn't because I was a female, and it wouldn't be understood if I were to be doing this. She says, I could cut my hair, I could wear boys' clothes, but that wasn't well received. She says, my father is the Nazarene, so, hint, hint, is his half-brother. And my father is the forge master. He works with metal. His name is Joseph. So the Nazarene is leaving with a group to spread his teachings, which they do by example. And I'm going to repeat this over and over because there's nothing I abhor more than a proselytizing missionary person, door to door, in your face type pushing religion. And I've had too many friends who've done that. It's horrible. And it's antithetical to the teachings of Jesus. He told them specifically not to do that. Teach by example, lead by example. You want them to understand your spiritual point of view, go out there and take care of the least, the lepers, the poor. And her father's afraid of letting her go. She says, I live in Jerusalem, and she said that some things in Hebrew, she was able to say some things in Hebrew under transit, and she didn't speak Hebrew. She said that it was called Jerusalem of gold. She said this in Hebrew. And this refers to the gold that surrounds the important part of the temple. But she says it's metaphorical because it also talks about love and kindness and light against fear and cruelty. It's the gold of being and not really the gold of metal that it's talking about. She's heard him speak to her dad when she was supposed to be asleep. So she had also gone to a meeting in disguise. She has some guts, in disguise, and the followers were a small group, and they keep the group small because they're afraid. They call him Jesus or the Nazarene, and her father calls him brother. She's not sure of the relationship between him and her uncle, her dad and her uncle. Is he a half-brother? Is he a whole brother? Not entirely sure how they're related. She doesn't see her grandparents very often. Her brother, her own biological brother, is studying with the rabbis and has left to go study with them in Jerusalem. Canon wonders, did her brother go to be with the Essenes? And she says that no, but his studies are secretive. So her description of Jesus matches the an ancient volume from 1887 that's it's an archival volume from 1887 that's in the Vatican Library. Naomi says, I am not my mother's child. I am not made to do the things she does. She says that he was teaching secret lessons underground. She remembers that she heard love and care for others as you have them do to you. The leaders see that his influence is stronger, and they notice his light, and they're afraid of his power of truth. He attracts people. This is scary. There's this government fear of rebellion, and the Jewish leadership fear of them losing their own power, and their fear of retaliation from the government, the Romans. So there's a lot going on. The leaders hoard wealth, and they don't care what happens to the sick or the poor, the religious leaders. Some of them know that this man speaks the truth, and they are torn. People under the Roman occupation are desperate, and many secret groups have formed, conspiring against the government, especially the Zealots. Judas Iscariot is one of them. They want war, and they want a strong leader, and they're hoping that this Jesus guy would be that person. They're not really listening to what he's saying. Various groups focused on him. The priests did not like his philosophy. He has a handful of close male followers, and one is named John, and then there's a Jeremiah. Naomi sometimes hears voices, and they're telling her that it's okay to do things like go to these meetings, because she's doing this deceptive stuff that's against her gender roles, but it's for the right reasons. She's not sure because girls are not taught, but she thinks that her family and Jesus are Jews. She's not sure. She doesn't know what she is. But he walks a different path from the mainstream, and because of that, there's a lot of unkindness in the law that he's rejecting, and that's upsetting people. The priest felt that he undermined their authority. She goes to a small nearby temple, but she's seen the big temple. She doesn't go to the, the big temple of Solomon. She describes the same things as Abigail does, and that it is confirmed by Canon's historical research. So this Jesus seems to have male followers, and there are women on the periphery, wives and sisters. Her father thinks that the king is unjust, that he hoards money. He's cruel to his slaves. He's punishing the people. People disappear at random for all kinds of weird reasons. She describes a small house that they live in. It has one main room, one corner of the parents' bedroom. She has a little alcove. There's an oven outside her alcove that keeps her warm. In another section is her father's workspace. They eat grains, fruit, fish, squash, green vegetables. Very seldomly will they have lamb, and even less often will they have beef. They drink goat's milk and water. Her father has brew, and they have wine and bread. After this session, Anna recalls seeing food and objects that she couldn't describe because she didn't have a name for them. She was raised Jewish, but she said nobody in her family talked Hebrew, and nobody in her family talked about Jesus. So as a child, she thought the history of Judaism was cruel, and she didn't know anything at all about the New Testament. So that's interesting. I'm going to stop here and end video 1 here, because this is the start of a new chapter now. And with any luck, I'll have this memorized by the end of this. Slangufoil, slancha.